family, and welcome to this episode of Legacy Chat. My name is Rick, and I'm an alcoholic. I was given the gift of sobriety on November 17th, 1987, and it's my privilege to be your host for this episode. Legacy Chat is a podcast made by and for members of AA to share their experience, strength, and hope on all three of our legacies in Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's a service of takethe12.org. That's takethe12.org, a three-legacy study website. All episodes of this podcast will be available to listen to or download completely free on takethe12.org. The primary purpose of our time together is to create a discussion space of our three legacies so our listeners might be able to have a richer and more personal experience of AA's 12 steps, 12 traditions, and 12 concepts for world service. Legacy Chat is not affiliated with Alcoholics Anonymous, and neither myself nor any of my guests in this podcast speak for AA as a whole. We're only here today to share our own unique experience on one of AA's three legacies. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about Tradition 12 and our second legacy of unity. And I am so honored to have with us today my special guest, Claudia H. Claudia, please introduce yourself. Tell our listeners a little bit about where you're from, your home group, your sobriety date, and a little bit about how you got to AA.
Very well. Hi, I'm Claudia. I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date is March 27, 1987. My home group is the Tuesday night speaker meeting of North Richland Hills / Haltom City. We're not real sure where we're located, but we're there. You can always call
in Texas.
In Texas, yes, it is. If you can't tell that from my twang, then there you go. And how I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, I was born and I drank a great deal. But truly, I guess the shortest version of that is I grew up in alcoholism and I didn't think I would be one, right, because I thought that I could figure it out, that they should be able to figure it out. I started drinking when I was about 13 and the miracle happened. I was tangled, twisted, afraid. I didn't know how to do people, do life. I had no clue. And I spent a lot of time early on and later on trying to make sure you didn't see that. You know, so I was living a double life even then. When I found alcohol, it was a miracle. You know, it felt as though I could do and say and be whomever I wanted to be. It was that power greater than myself that allowed me to do what I couldn't do on my own, aided will alone. And I thought, this is it, you know, so I did it as often as I could, wherever I could. And you know this because you came in 87 as well. Booze was easy to get back then. The rules that they have today, I'd be under the jail, okay? Because I'd get stopped with booze and at 14, 15, they'd either take it or dump it out.
Right.
You know, that was what occurred back then. I made my first bar when I was 14. I preferred brown whiskey. I had consequences early on. I mean, I blacked out for greater or lesser periods. I ran with lower companions. I still like lower companions somewhat. There you have it. So,
oh my God, we totally have that in common.
Yes, I'm attracted to them. Let's just say that. But I drank. I left home at 17 to get away from those crazy people. I blame them for the quality of my life. I went to college. I don't know how I managed to get through that. I don't remember most of college. I got married in an effort to be okay. By the time I'm 21, I'm having problems, but I don't see it as the alcohol. It has to be something outside. If I could just change that and make that okay, then I would automatically be okay. And that's not what happened, because as it says in Bill's story, gradually things got worse. And that's exactly what happened. I got married. I don't know why I married this guy, other than he lived close to my job and my daddy hated him. It made perfect sense to me at the time, you know, because I thought, well, that's another thing. If I get married, I'll be different, you know, again, not the alcohol. I went on to have children. And this is where my bottom occurs, is that I drank through those pregnancies. I was the drunk mom. And at that point, I know I'm an alcoholic. I almost talked on Tradition 11 because the reason I'm here today is attraction, not promotion. My mother came into the program in 1981 and she showed me the way. And that was a very powerful thing for me because she never shook her finger. She never shamed me. She never said you're an alcoholic. Mm-hmm. She was an example of the program, and it was very, very powerful to me. Mm-hmm. And I came to on March 27, 1987. And that day wasn't any different than any day had been for several years before that. I'd been drinking. But what I saw at that moment, in that moment of clarity, I believe it was God-given. And I don't think Tradition 12, that God just said, that's just for Claudia. I believe that's for everybody. What I will never understand, other than the attraction, not promotion, is why I picked up the phone, why I took action on that day. I think I had run out of ideas. I'd quit trying to figure it out, to do it on my own. I lost that last shred of arrogance that said, I can figure it out. And I called AA, and it made all the difference. And what happened is AA happened to me.
Right.
Where I was, again, most fortunate is I walked into a meeting, a group of Alcoholics Anonymous, not something else, not a BB, but an AA.
Right.
A group that practiced the traditions as a way of life, and I did what they told me to do. My kids were 4, 2, and 18 months when I came in. So I was the drunk mom. That's my story, is the drunk mom,
Well, I can tell you that we are, all of the people in your life who know you are incredibly grateful that you came to AA and that you stayed, because you have had a massive impact in the lives of so very many. So thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. So let's jump right into it. I'm going to read a couple of things that are kind of going to jumpstart the conversation. I want to read from the foreword of the 12 and 12. I love how in the foreword of the 12 and 12, Bill wrote a beautiful paragraph that perfectly describes what our 12 steps are. And then right below that, he wrote a beautiful paragraph that perfectly describes what our 12 traditions are. And he says this: AA's 12 traditions apply to the life of the fellowship itself. They outline the means by which AA maintains its unity and relates itself to the world about it, the way it lives and grows. And I also want to read both the short form and the long form of the tradition. The short form of Tradition 12 is this: anonymity is the spiritual foundation of all our traditions, ever reminding us to place principles before personalities. And the long form is, and finally, we of Alcoholics Anonymous believe that the principle of anonymity has an immense spiritual significance. It reminds us that we are to place principles before personalities, that we are actually to practice genuine humility. This to the end that our great blessings may never spoil us, that we shall forever live in thankful contemplation of him who presides over us all. And I love how in the long form, it really kind of elevates or illuminates what I believe the spiritual principle of Tradition 12 to be, which is this idea of principles before personalities, right? The overriding idea of Tradition 12 for me has always been principles first, people second. And prior to coming to the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, that just never was the case for me. But so I want to ask you this quick question. Why did you say yes to speaking on Tradition 12?
Well, should I give the humble answer? No. Sorry, couldn't help that. I love to have fun in AA. That was one of the things that really attracted me.
We're not a glum lot.
I have a lot of experience. I've been around some days, good and bad. Right. And I would like to say I learned from the good experience, but a lot of times I've learned the importance of these principles by getting to the edge, by violating them, if you would. And that experience is just as important as the good experience, more so, in fact, because sometimes I really learn where the edges are that way. Right. That, and I read something the other day in a literature study, and I'm one of these people that I get a hold of an idea, and it just kind of is a theme in my life for a while, you know, and I'd like to read it because I think it goes to this. And
please.
Yes, I agree, it's principles before personalities, but I'm going to say this. I believe it's anonymity. Now, when we talk about anonymity, and if you read the foreword to the first edition, you see the reason that we don't give last names and we're anonymous at the level of press, radio, and film. But anonymity as a spiritual idea is the thought of giving with no return. And the truth is we do get a return. But anyway, I read this in Language of the Heart, and it's in the third section, the guidance of AA's world affairs. But it says, God has granted us 3 graces, and grace is unearned and undeserved. Okay. The first is freedom from a deadly affliction. The second is a life experience that enables us to give that priceless freedom to others. And finally, a visioning of an ever widening of God's reality and love. Now, those are gifts, you know,
right?
They are gifts. And so therefore, to give with no thought of return, which is what we're called to do, is a big deal because I've already been given the gift. I've already been given the gift. You know, when I came into the program, my sponsor said this 12th step started day 1. That my commitment to my home group started day 1. She assigned me my first several commitments, you know, but she said, we give back and we do it for fun and for free. Right. And that means I don't get paid for it. I don't get applause for it. And I think the purity of that idea is just so appealing, you know, and part of the way that I reach for the ideal is I work to place the principles above the personalities, because there's a lot of personalities out there, you know, and I learned that in the home group.
Right.
I learned that in my family, you know, but so that's what pulls me in there, is that I give back because I've been given to.
Right. And, you know, I want to circle back to something you just said a moment ago about, I don't get applause for this. Right. I remember when I first got sober, you and I both got sober in the same year. I will always have a minor resentment because you're 8 months soberer than I am. But I'll get over it, or I'll write some inventory on it or call my sponsor or something. But when I first came in, I remember feeling like I wanted to shout it from the mountaintops. I wanted to tell everyone that I was sober, and I wanted to tell everyone that I was a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And this idea of humility, it wasn't until I got in, really had a sponsor. I'm so grateful for good and effective sponsorship.
Yes.
I had a sponsor the first time I really went through step 7. And in addition to, because we all know that step 7 in the big book is 1 paragraph, but Bill's essay on step 7 in the 12 and 12 is just phenomenal. Yeah. And I could talk about that for hours, but Bill writes in the 12 and 12 that humility, at least his one definition of humility, could be the desire to seek and do God's will. If I am constantly seeking to do God's will, desiring to seek and do God's will in my life, the very last thing I'm going to want to do is to point the finger at me. I'm going to, you know, what can I do to be of maximum service to God and to his kids? So I'm grateful that you highlighted that idea of, you know, we don't get the applause, and it is about humility, and humility is such an important part of this tradition.
Yes, it absolutely is. And another one of my favorite definitions from the literature is Humility is a right knowledge of who and what I am. Now that morphs into, for me, I am not God.
Right.
They are not God. It is not God. God is God, and Claudia is not. And that keeps me in my place. Okay. And therefore, when I go in and I want to get my will in the group conscience, because I know 100% that I'm absolutely right, that should be a sign for me that I'm probably very, very wrong.
Excuse me, that made me think of when y'all were, because you started a new group, the Tuesday night speaker meeting, and I remember you telling me about the night that y'all were sitting there trying to name the group, and if memory serves me correctly, it didn't end up being the name you wanted.
No, it did not, and I had more time than those boys did, and they should have respected my position enough to have allowed me to choose the name. Exactly. But oh no. Let me tell you what's funny. I have a grand sponsee in Austin, and she just started a new group. And you know what the name of it is? The Monday night speaker meeting.
Oh, how funny is that? I love that.
The God of my understanding is comedian is what the truth is.
Boy, ain't that the truth.
Yes.
So one of the questions that I have in some of the other recordings that I've done, episodes that I've done on the traditions, is I've asked the question, when we first come into the rooms, we see the shades on the wall and we see the steps and we see the traditions. And in some rooms, we also see the concepts. But I can assure you that most alcoholics walking into the room the very first time can barely even grasp that first shade. At what point in your recovery were the traditions brought into your life, and how did that happen?
Well, we went through them formally, of course, but not in the first year. But it was more one. Like I said before, I was lucky enough to walk into a very traditions-based group. Okay. So leadership demonstrated that, but also it was as we went along. For example, as I said earlier, you have a commitment and you keep a commitment. One of the first things I learned is if you make the commitment, you keep it, because we're reaching for integrity, which is step 5. But we're reaching for that you're going to be as good as your word. You cannot keep the commitment if you're in the hospital, if you're dead, one of your children is in the hospital. Those may be reasons, but otherwise, you keep the commitment. If you absolutely cannot fulfill it, you need to get hold of that phone list. You need to call somebody and make sure that commitment is filled. It was almost sacrosanct, holy. The other thing I would see is that when in a discussion meeting, and they were very controlled. They had guidelines for chairing a meeting. If someone came in and they violated singleness of purpose, what would happen is or if it was very egregious, during the meeting, someone with time would get up, take them outside, and talk to them about what singleness of purpose was. You didn't bring in outside literature. Someone tried one time, several people got up, stopped the meeting, turned it over to somebody else. So I saw it demonstrated. It was part of the fabric of being a home group member there and being sponsored by the lady that sponsored me. I was unaware of that that's what was happening till later on. And then I would go, oh yeah, got it. And have experience, because my experience is what I've done and what happened. Okay. But it's also what I've seen done and what happened then as well. That becomes part of that fabric. And so that's the way it was introduced to me. Now, quite frankly, I didn't see it as my responsibility. Well, no, look, truth, I'm going to work at honesty here, is that the first year they did not get better right away.
Right.
I went to a women's shelter at 11 months sober. I had 3 kids. It took me 4 years, 27 court appearances, 3 social studies, and 20 grand I did not have to get divorced. I worked 2 jobs a lot. I was a single parent. And so it was somebody else's responsibility. the old timers would get up and stop somebody from making a drug talk, okay, and those
Right.
kinds of things.
Right.
Um, it wasn't personal to me. And I was pretty unaware that I was getting the traditions throughout that time by my sponsor's guidance and direction, by the things she would suggest for me to do. The fact that we had tradition speakers once a year. Now, my late husband's sponsor was David A., who was a delegate and a trustee.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that's the other thing I thought about with this tradition. He has a talk, if you can find it. It's called The Spirit of Sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that really sacrifice is in all of the principles, but especially tradition 12.
Right.
It asks us to sacrifice what we think, our ego, for the good of something larger than ourselves.
Which we never like to do.
No,
Never.
it's not instinctual.
No,
Okay.
it's definitely not our default response. But I love your because what I just heard you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in answer to the question of at what point were the traditions brought into your life,
Mm-hmm.
they were brought into your life, if I heard you correctly, through demonstration. You got to see them in action in your home group, which actually leads us into the next question I was going to ask, but I'm not going to ask it now, although I'm going to say it, is how does your home group help its members better understand the traditions? Now, that is how your home group then helped newcomers and members understand the traditions. What about your home group today?
Well, when we started the group, we talked about our values in Alcoholics Anonymous
Mm-hmm.
and being principled and being tradition based. And for example, I'm going to be speaker getter my next turn of the rotation.
Mm-hmm.
And we ask that our speakers, one, watch their language from behind the podium. I like to call that face of AA. Now, that's attraction, not promotion, but I think it's also this as well, that they dress appropriately. As my first sponsor told me, you're going to an AA meeting, not a cocktail party.
Right.
You know? Well, I could say something else, but I won't, because that would be a real broad statement, and that
Speaking of broad statement, I am going to have to bring it up. For our listeners, I told Claudia prior to we got into the recording this today that when I met her years and years ago, I remember the very first thing that I thought was, and I know you can't see her, but you can hear her, and so you kind of get a sense about what I'm about to say is that I remember thinking, after hearing her speak, I thought, she is the absolute epitome of that old word we used to use back in the day, where a particular kind of woman was a broad. And I remember thinking when I saw Claudia speaking that I could just see her with a cigarette in one hand and a cocktail in the other hand, and and that voice, it just was perfect. So yeah, I will forever think of you as a broad, but endearingly.
I'm so glad you said that, because I have to say this, and it's probably inappropriate too, but at my age, and because of the gifts of Alcoholics Anonymous, I don't worry about that too much. But I've gone like to speak to this, and they'll say, "Well, are you the Al-Anon speaker?" And I'm almost offended. It's like, really? Listen to me and look at me. What made you think that? Sorry, couldn't help myself.
I love it.
But
I love it. I love it.
back to your question. So we wrote that into our bylaws.
Good.
And we also are very concerned about having a commitment, and that idea of commitment to a home group. And when I look at sobriety, the fact that I'm 34 years sober today, it's the commitments that kept me in the middle of the boat. Correct. It's the commitments that brought the traditions alive to me.
Correct.
That brought me into a place where I had to apply the principles there and continue to have to do so.
Right.
But those ideas, the fact that when we approach someone that's going to be a speaker, that we ask those things. And there are a lot of people that are not willing to conform to that.
That's
and
right.
we go, these are the dictates of our group conscience.
Right.
And they were approved unanimously. Concept 12 talks about substantial unanimity, which I love.
Right.
And that was the other thing I was thinking about, principles before personalities, is that's been tested this year, as has tradition 10. Is we've tested and continue to be tested.
As it ever.
So not looking at all sides of the equation on the issues that have pummeled the home group, if you will, in the last couple of years.
Right.
And the fact that we had substantial unanimity on every decision that we made makes me very proud. We're not a very big group, but I'm very, very proud that we held the line, because a lot of times when you're practicing principles, you don't get applause.
That is absolutely correct. And I could not agree with you more. I know that your home group and my home group, we are started around the same time. We're both fairly new groups. In fact, my home group just celebrated our third year on the 4th of January, which was yesterday. And we, we're a small group as well. And we didn't know, I think we knew what we wanted. We had a vision for what we wanted the group to be, but we had no idea that we were going to have to deal with all of the emotional aspect of a pandemic, right? Yes. And all of the stuff that has brought up. And so many, we just live in a very, very volatile society today. And I'm just so proud or honored, or I don't even know what the right word is, that I'm part of a home group that has survived all of that as a result of the fact that we consider ourselves a group that believes in respecting and honoring all three of our legacies, right? And you talked a minute ago about something that I wanted to circle back on, about through this learning process, and what is one of the best ways to learn. And you kind of hinted at it when you said one of the best ways to learn about a tradition is just to break it right and left and to violate it. And I don't encourage that to all of the listeners out there. I don't encourage this, but I can tell you that it has been my experience that I'm going to learn a very quick, valuable lesson about the spiritual principles inside that tradition if I go violate it and screw it up.
Absolutely. Then it stays in my memory.
That's right.
Is what happens. And I've done it. I try to pause more the older I get. I pray for God to help me remember to pause and step back and get counsel and look at my motivations and things like that. But I can I remember one of the first times that, I remember there was a group back in the day when the smoking issue was the big thing. Right. Remember that?
I do remember that.
We had some bloody fights over that.
I'll bet.
And if you're new, ignore that. Don't worry. It'll be okay. It'll roll in and roll out. That's the way stuff always does in Alcoholics Anonymous. The biggest fights I've ever seen were over the color of the carpet, which had nothing to do anything about our primary purpose.
The ply of the toilet paper, or the kind of coffee, or oh my God, we're just such alcoholics. It's crazy.
Yes. Well, what I did is I chose not to vote.
Right.
And my sponsor had something to say about that. She said, you have an opinion, and your opinion is valid.
That's right.
And in Concept 12, when it talks about we're a democratic society, everybody has a voice.
Right.
But I didn't want to make anybody mad. I was being people pleasing.
I'm sorry, I don't relate to that at all.
I know you don't at all. And,
at all.
Because some of us are just more spiritual. For your listeners, Rick is an icon of spirituality.
Don't even listen to that. That is so far from the truth. So listen, I want to go back and I want to circle back to something else, because my mind is just kind of all over the place because I'm loving this conversation. But in the foreword of the 12 and 12, when it says about the traditions that they outline the means by which AA maintains its unity and relates to the world about it, right?
Yes.
I mean, obviously the traditions were designed and built for the groups to stay healthy, right? So that we can keep unity inside the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. But I don't know about you, but I have loved in my 34 years being open to the possibility that the principles that are found inside the traditions can apply in all areas of my life, in my personal relationships, at work, in my relationships with God and with fellow members of AA. So this idea of sacrifice, or this idea of anonymity in Tradition 12, do you have any examples of how you have practically applied that in your personal life, say, and in your work life?
Absolutely. And I'm going to ping to something else, sponsorship. I'll give you an example. And because it's different now than it was in the beginning of my sobriety. I've been able to take a lot of different positions in Alcoholics Anonymous. I still believe the most humble one was when I was washing ashtrays, or if I'm cleaning the toilet. Okay. I think that's more in line with the spirit of sacrifice. Having said that, though, we have the Tarrant County-wide, as you're well aware, here in the Fort Worth, Dallas area. And one of my sponsees was involved in it. And her job was to get greeters. And I called her and I said, I want to greet. And she said, Claudia, we're trying to get people that don't have anything else to do, that don't have 12-step work to do. And I went, well, okay. And I had to immediately go do a 10th step.
Exactly.
Call my sponsor. But sometimes it's not taking the position.
Right.
Principles for personalities.
Right.
Sometimes it's pulling that person in at the group. That's the wall hanger that will do it if asked, but they need to be asked.
Right.
Not thinking I get to do everything,
Sure.
There's an old timer at my group who practices this so well. He offers experience. He doesn't demand his way in a group conscience if asked. And he's unflappable. He doesn't get mad. He doesn't get sensitive.
Right.
In my family life, with the COVID, with the volatility of the political landscape right now, I have a large family. I have 6 children, 2 step, 1 borrowed, 3 regular. I have 7 grandchildren. I have cousins, in-laws, outlaws, whoever they've got, whoever their significant other is of the day, du jour. And it's all over the place, as far as you want to go on either end of the spectrum. And for me to practice this here is to keep my mouth shut and to say, isn't that nice? Well, I'm glad you feel that way. And not have to get into a pitched battle over who's right and who's wrong. One of a tool that one of my sponsors gave me really helps to practice this. And what do they do right? Okay. Instead of pigeonholing them in a box and saying, this is all that they are. What do they do right? The other thing is we have big family get-togethers, and a lot of times I don't want to be a part of the big family get-together, or they want to do it this way. We want to have it at this location. Well, I don't want to have it at that location, and I'd like to push and shove and politic all around. Okay. Sounds like a bad group conscience, doesn't it? Go on a whisper campaign and explain to everybody why they're wrong. That is not good for family unity. I can just tell you right there. It is against it. But if I place principles, the unity of the family, what's good for the whole, above what I want to do, then everything runs smoothly. And I can be that power driver,
Yeah.
I can be.
I'm really glad that you connected it back to the unity, right? Because
Mhm.
I remember I was, and I've shared this before, that I was in a tradition study with PJH, PJ,
Mhm.
and PJ said something that I'd never heard before, which was anytime you violate a tradition 2 through 12, you're automatically violating tradition 1.
Always,
And
always.
I'd never thought about that, but I absolutely love that. Absolutely love that. I think it's amazing. So I'm gonna ask you.
PJ's someone you need to get on this podcast.
I do need to get her on
I've
this
known her
podcast.
for a very long time.
I'm glad you suggested that. I will reach out to her. I would love to have her talk about traditions. Her tradition study was one of the most eye-opening things I had ever been to regarding the traditions, if for no other reason that she made them personally applicable.
That's what I love.
Right?
That's what I love, is that because they function at the level of the group, but they're also about, again, personal responsibility.
Right.
In every area of my life.
Right.
You were talking about business. I had my own business and I taught school for a long time, and I know this is heresy, but some of those ninth graders I really didn't like. They're mean, they're ugly, they say ugly things, really ugly things,
right.
And they would test my patience. The fact is that I learned more from those children than anybody else, but I'm still required to apply the rules evenly, to give them the same chance,
right.
to see what they do right, as my sponsor said, because if not, that's unfair.
Right.
and they didn't like me either, and I have to remember that, that if I'm giving this child a chance over here to do makeup work because I like that kid, because I know that kid's personal situation, but I don't want to give this other kid the same break.
Right.
That's not placing principles before personalities.
Well, and it's also the perfect example of in fact, a beautiful example of practicing these principles in all our affairs.
Yes.
Claudia, if you'll allow me, I'm going to read just a quick excerpt from the Tradition 12, from the tradition study that we have on takethe12.org. And I'm going to read it to you, and I'm just going to throw it back out to you and see if it'll generate some additional conversation. Why are we repeatedly asked in the traditions to give up ourselves for the greater good? The answer is because any relationship we have that does not involve sacrifice is a relationship that will likely not endure. Each tradition straightens out a disastrous attitude we had about relationships. The 12th tradition teaches us that a spirit of sacrifice, oftentimes through anonymity, as you mentioned, is vital to good relationships. Giving up the expectation of rewards for doing good is difficult for most of us. It's easy for us to give and then think, well, I'll get a reward even if I don't get public recognition for what I did. But to remove that reward symbol from the back of our minds for whatever good we do is part of practicing anonymity. The next time you hear a speaker in AA whose personality is exciting from the platform, see if you can hear the principles behind their words. To which step, tradition, or concept can you relate their pitch? Setting ourselves aside and focusing on the principles of our program is a crucial component in the foundation we need for studying the traditions and learning how to be healthier relationships with our fellow AAs and with those in the world around us. Did anything in that reading resonate to you?
Oh, absolutely. The book talks about that our problem is ego, selfish and self-centeredness.
Right.
I had a sponsor that used to say ego deflation at depth, and she would take her hand and point up to the sky. And I used to think, oh my God, that sounds painful. And yes, it is. But my ego, that selfish self-centeredness, the main problem of the alcoholic is in the mind. It's always there.
Right.
It's like the bad angel on your shoulder. It's always there, and it's looking for opportunity. So all I have is practice. I have to practice to keep that ego in check. I do think it gets easier not to have to be the one, not to have to lead every charge after a while, you know, but it takes a lot of practice to do that. And again, I'm going to say it's the edges. You know, we were talking about the pandemic and the volatile situation the other day, and I had someone call me, not someone I sponsor, but they were very, very vocal about where they are on the political spectrum. Mm-hmm. And they said, you know, I know you're like this. And I paused. Thank you, God. Again, praying for pausing is good.
Right, for
I paused sure. And I thought, how do you not step into this? Now, I wanted to say, this is what I think, and this is why I think that you are so terribly wrong. I did not, because that has no place in Alcoholics Anonymous. Right. So I paused, and then I said, I'll tell you who I am. And she said, okay. And I said, I'm Claudia, and I'm an alcoholic.
Right on.
You know.
Right on.
But it's that it's pushing down that want to be heard, you know, as though I can get validation from that. My first sponsor said my self-worth and value must come from God. They're not safe anyplace else. And I think that's what this tradition also leads me back to, is God is my center. It's not what they think of me, their applause, their money, their gifts, their adoration, their respect or lack of respect. Because I can do the same thing if you talk ugly about me, you know, and it's the same thing. It's just the other side of the coin. I can get just as obsessed with that and proving you wrong, and then I'm going to be violating traditions. I'm not going to be practicing principles instead of just letting you be okay. You talked earlier about separation from God. That's what my self-centeredness and my ego does. Mm-hmm. These principles, when I even try just barely to practice them, bring me closer. It's that ever widening reality of God that it talked about in Language of the Heart, you know.
I love that. I absolutely love that. And I think that you have sort of already answered this question, but I'm going to ask it in a little different way. What were your biggest obstacles in being able to practically apply the spiritual principle of this step, whether it be principles before personalities or sacrifice or anonymity or whatever it happens to be? What were some of the biggest obstacles? I mean, what did you have to surrender for you to be able to apply the spiritual principles in your life today?
One, that idea that if you smiled at me, I was okay. You know, and it really hampered me in sponsorship. You know, it really did, because we're required to love unconditionally, but also be honest and tell the truth and walk away. So I had to give up that. Also had to give up that idea in my head, the vision, if I'm working with the newcomer, of where they could go and what they could do. That's my vision, okay? Mm-hmm. I don't know their road. I don't know their journey. I don't know what God's will is for them. I believe it's God's will for us all to be sober. But I get that vision, right, and I'm going to drag them into sobriety. You know, I'm going to beat those principles into their head. And as I do that, I'm violating nearly every one of them. You know, and I'm not leaving them. I'm not leaving the door open to the idea of Alcoholics Anonymous as a solution. Right. And that may be the biggest crime of all when I do that. So that really hampered me. That, and I get to thinking I know. Right. You know, it hampered me getting sober, and it can hamper me today. I will think, this is what needs to happen here. This is what my home group needs to do. This is what my sponsee needs to do. This is what my children need to do. This is what that customer of mine needs to do. And it all revolves around what makes Claudia okay, or what I think makes Claudia okay. You know, what does the book say? We get what we need and find it was invariably what we wanted all along.
Absolutely.
You
And
know?
the only way, I don't know if your experience has been anything like mine, but the only way that I ever get to that point is when I'm willing to do the inventory. I have
Yes.
to be willing to do the inventory, which made me think, I want to just highlight the fact that the AA Grapevine published a beautiful checklist. It's called the AA Traditions Checklist, and it's a beautiful inventory in that it's not only just for the group, but I mean, it can also be, there's a lot of personal application to it. And I highly recommend that if you're wanting to check yourself, and I'm saying this to our listeners, if you want to check yourself and find out how you're doing on the principles of the traditions, particularly, go find the traditions checklist. It's actually on takethe12.org in our tradition study at the bottom of every tradition, but you can also just Google AA traditions checklist and you can get a copy of it, or go to aa.org to get one. But on this idea of inventory, do you have any, I can only imagine you've got some funny stories. As you were doing inventory, I mean, you're like, what can you share that has come up that might be beneficial for some of our listeners?
That you mentioned those questions. I love those questions because it makes it personal.
Right.
And you talked about the lamp, lampshade or the window shade on the wall. Mm-hmm. And it's not till it becomes personal that I really begin to get what the principle is and why it's important.
That's right.
I really like step 11. Okay. And, but inventory alone isn't all that I need. I also need the accountability of a sponsor, because I cannot see all. Okay. I cannot see everything that I'm doing. I'll call my sponsor and think I've got a scathingly brilliant idea and I've never done it before. And she'll go, no, you've done it 1,000 times. And it's my mission before I die to break you of this one. So I think that's what she said 2 weeks ago. Okay. Just so you know. But, I've, and I do the 11th step inventory at night. Mm-hmm. I also have a propensity to build a case against someone or something. And I do it a little by slow. And I can be blissfully unaware of that, but I'll start looking at what they're doing wrong.
Right.
And before I know it, I say something that engenders an amends.
Right.
Person at my last home group, last nerve. They acted like they'd read the traditions, but I doubted it. Yeah. And I would just go, look at that. There they go again. I'll keep it gender neutral.
Right, okay. Right.
Okay. And I mean, I'm just like, mm-hmm. And he was worthy of my scorn, in my estimation, okay, as they all are.
Right.
Well, I decided he needed the benefit of what I had to say. And I wasn't the first one that had done this. And we had pretty much had a pretty good relationship, okay? Not close or anything like that. But hi, bye, how are you? Isn't that nice? And other people had talked to him, and I made it a point during a group conscience to direct many of my comments to some things that he had said that I thought were horrible violations of our traditions. Well, you know what I've done then? I have created an enemy. And the book says we step on the toes of others and they retaliate. And that's exactly what happened. And so then I'm in full blown resentment. Then I do a 10th step and I share it with my sponsor. And she, her deal is, where are you at fault?
Right.
I really don't care what they did. I do not care what they did, because that's not where the solution is,
Right. Right.
And I made amends, but I want to tell you something. He still pokes at me. Oh, sorry, no gender neutrality there.
That's
whenever
okay.
I say it, and I'd like to tell you that was in the first 5 years of my sobriety. Nope. It was about 5 years ago.
There you go.
And, but I was right. Okay.
Right.
I was right. Technically, according to the letter of the law, so to speak, I was right. What made it even worse is that this is a person who has not been able to string together a lot of sobriety. I know. Wronger.
Well,
okay.
We learn. I mean, we learn through our mistakes, right?
And yes,
and I think I was just going to say, the other thing I think is important that we need to say out loud here is that, since you and I have both the same amount of time, is that I think one of the most important things that people with long-term sobriety can do is to get up to the podium and tell the truth. Right.
Yes.
To be able to say that there was and in my case, a period of 4 years, from 18 to 22 years, that the only thing I did right was didn't drink. Right. And I was miserable, and I wasn't doing service, and I wasn't connected, and I wasn't in the book, and I wasn't giving back to the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I went in and I did nothing but stir up crap. Every time I went into a meeting, I was sick, but I wasn't drinking. And telling the truth about those things from the podium or in a share or whenever is vital, because there's always going to be someone who's going to be sitting out there listening to that who can go, oh my God, I identify.
Absolutely. And I know I don't have the power to make that person drink,
right,
or not drink. I mean, I know that, but it really did pull me up short.
Sure.
And made me think more about pausing before I dive in. Right. To be a member among members. Last night at the home group, I'd been doing something a certain way, and someone said, oh, that's not the way you want to do it. Now, my first reaction was, you're wrong, and let me tell you why I'm wrong, and I've been around longer than you, and Nope. Right. I went, you know what? Because I paused, and in that pause, a lot of times God can come in and go, Claudia, just shut up, because they have the right to learn too. And I think that's something else about having time, is that I need to support that. And this is a different tradition, but I need to support people to take on other jobs and then not criticize them.
That's right.
Be there and support them. And really, a lot of the times that I hone in on stuff like that, it's apples and oranges.
Right. I love it.
It's apples and oranges. How we thank the speaker is not important, as long as we thank the speaker.
As long as we thank the speaker, exactly.
Yes.
We get caught up in just some of the craziest stuff. But Claudia, we are just about out of time. Is there anything that you would like to offer as a closing comment on this tradition? Anything you want our listeners to remember as they begin to put spiritual principles into practical application in their lives?
What I said at the beginning, we've been given a lot of gifts. I heard a speaker the other night, and she said, I can tell you what my worst day was, and it's not today. We get caught up in the minutia, but today is not my worst day. I clearly remember my worst day, And what that makes me think of is the grace that I've been given, the freedom from alcoholism today, the ability to help others. That promise in the ninth step comes true with a sordid, ugly story. A God of my understanding. I've been given a gift. Why would I want a reward for that? And when I can do that, with nobody knowing, I get that peace that in another venue would say passes all understanding. Mm-hmm. That purity of the soul that I did not have when I came here. I couldn't have imagined it.
That's right.
It's a gift. It's a gift.
Thank you so very much for your time and for your service today. I am just completely confident that our listeners are going to be able to take away a lot from your sharing. Claudia, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I love you.
Just a reminder to everyone that you can go to takethe12.org to learn more about all three of our legacies in AA through STEP, traditions, and concept studies, blog posts, videos, books, and so much more. Until next time, let us not forget Bill W.'s words when he said this: we clearly see AA in three dimensions: the dimension of recovery, the dimension of unity, and the dimension of service. Without any one of these, AA couldn't function. God bless.